So our hearts go out once again to Boston, but I do think that it does need to be done, again, on a judgment basis on where the threat really exists.
And if I can just add, we know that first responders are being cut. We know that community...
All of this in our video library at cspan.org. We'll take you live now to the House floor. 3 bills today, votes at 1:30.
Prayer will be offered by our chaplain, Father Conroy.
Let us pray. Eternal God, we give you thanks for giving us another day. As the People's House gathers today, our nation's heart is heavy, as once again our domestic tranquility has been shattered by the selfish and violent actions witnessed yesterday near the finish line of the Boston Marathon. We ask your blessing, Lord, on those who died and those who mourned them, on those who were physically injured, and on those who have been emotionally traumatized. We give you thanks for those many who responded to the injured and to those who kept the order and keep it still. And send your Spirit upon whomever perpetrated this bombing and others who might contemplate emulating it. Calm their troubled souls, stay their violent hands. May those tasked with investigating this tragedy find success in their work so that justice might be served and peace returned to our nation's communities. May all that is done this day be for your greater honor and glory. Amen.
The Chair has examined the journal of the last day's proceedings and announces to the House his approval thereof pursuant to Clause 1 of Rule 1. The journal stands approved. Pledge of Allegiance today will be led by the gentleman from Texas, Mr. O'Rourke. Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. The Chair lays before the House a communication.
The Honorable the Speaker, House of Representatives, Sir, in light of my recent appointment to the House Committee on Financial Services, I hereby resign my position on both the House Committee on the Judiciary and the House Committee on Homeland Security. Signed sincerely, Keith Rothfuss, Member of Congress.
Without objection, the resignations are accepted. For what purpose, General Lady from Washington State rise.
Mr. Speaker, by direction of the House Republican Conference, I send to the desk a privileged resolution and ask for its immediate consideration.
The clerk will report the resolution.
House Resolution 162, resolved that the following named member be and is hereby elected to the following standing committee of the House of Representatives. Committee on Financial Services, Mr. Rothfuss.
Without objection, the resolution is agreed to and the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The Chair will entertain up to 15 requests for 1-minute speeches on each side of the aisle. For what purpose does General Lady from Kansas rise? Objection.
Today I would like to honor Sage Halseth, a 5th grade student at Shawnee Heights Elementary School in Topeka, Kansas, who has brought together her community by helping her classmate Alex White. Alex suffers from a progressive neurological condition that affects his balance and mobility and relied on a special companion, a service dog named Hope, until March when Hope was tragically killed by a motorist. For Alex, Hope was a blessing, a best friend, and to quote Alex directly, quite the chick magnet. Sage knows how much Alex depended on Hope, and she started a fundraising campaign to help him afford a new service dog. She wrote letters sharing his story and sold wristbands that read, "Always have hope." I want to thank Sage, a caring young leader and inspiration to her community, for her selfless commitment to helping her friend Alex. It's because of young people like Alex and Sage that even after yesterday's tragedy in Boston, we can always have hope. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from New York rise? Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, on Friday I will participate in a symposium on dementia being sponsored by the Western New York chapter of the Alzheimer's Association. This event is a reminder that while progress has been made in understanding Alzheimer's, there is still a great deal that we must learn about how to treat this terrible illness. Alzheimer's is a disease whose origins are unknown, but whose end is absolutely certain. It's a disease that's touched the families of many in this chamber, including my own. According to the Alzheimer's Association, as many as 5 million Americans have Alzheimer's disease, with its prevalence expected to increase over the next several decades. With so many in Washington mindlessly devoted to the agenda of austerity, we must remember that our budget is not only an accounting statement, but also a statement of our values. I urge the rejection of austerity and an increase in the funding we need for medical research to find a cure for diseases like Alzheimer's that devastate so many American families. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As part of my ongoing effort to protect precious hard-earned taxpayer dollars by going after waste, fraud, and abuse, I've introduced a common sense bill, H.R. 1502. Listen up. The Social Security, Disability Insurance, and Unemployment Benefits Double Dip Elimination Act of 2013. This bill would stop people from receiving disability at the same time they are receiving unemployment. Under current law, a person can receive both disability and unemployment at the same time. This isn't right. Just doesn't make sense. I don't know how someone can be able and available to work and also be unable to work because of a disability. I urge my colleagues to support this common sense bill in order to help make sure the disability program is there for those who truly cannot work. President Obama also included a similar proposal in his budget, and I look forward to working with the administration to get this bill signed into law. Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask for unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of immigration reform. I wanted to take a moment to read an excerpt from a letter I received from Father Sean Carroll, a Jesuit priest who is with the Keno Border Initiative in Arizona. He writes, I have been working with deported migrant men, women, and children along the U.S. border with Mexico. These past 4 years, I have witnessed their brokenness in body and spirit. I have held the hand of a mother separated from her children in Chicago and listened to a father deported away from his children in North Dakota. I have been present with the son seeking to be reunited with his mother in Central California. I know God calls us not to oppress the widow, the orphan, and the stranger, Exodus 22 and Deuteronomy 27. And yet I've witnessed to how we make widows out of women migrants when we deport them away from their husbands. And I'm aware of how we turn U.S. children into orphans by repatriating their parents to Mexico and placing them in foster care. I see the ways we reject the stranger, the person seeking a better life for their families, the one who in the Gospel of Matthew reflects the presence of Jesus himself. What would happen if we accepted God's invitation to remember the moments that we were in exile, in Exodus, the times when we felt like strangers, and to recall how God had led us through those experiences to life? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Ohio rise?
Ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute, revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, we saw yet another sickening act of terror yesterday in Boston. It was a grim reminder that there is evil in the world. There are those with dark hearts and twisted ideologies bent on killing Americans because of who we are and the values we hold dear. Early reports indicate the bombs were packed with metal ball bearings to inflict maximum carnage on the innocent. One of the innocent was an 8-year-old boy, found dead among the smoke, confusion, and blood. 8 years old. As we track down the killer or killers, let us pray for the victims and their families. And let us resolve to never take the freedoms we enjoy as Americans for granted. Never take the service of those who protect our freedoms for granted.
never forget those who've made the ultimate sacrifice, and to never underestimate the lengths to which America's enemies will go to do us harm. But, Mr. Speaker, our enemies should never, ever underestimate America's resolve to hold accountable those responsible for this deadly attack. And I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise? Without objection, the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to remember William Brown McIlvaine III, a naval flight officer from El Paso, Texas, who led an exemplary life. Lieutenant junior grade McIlvaine died last month during a training flight when his Prowler airplane crashed. In his 24 years, William accomplished remarkable things and touched many lives with his friendship and his kindness. He was commissioned from the U.S. Naval Academy with merit in May 2010 with a degree in chemistry. His lifelong dream was to fly, and he earned his wings in May 2012 at the Pensacola Naval Air Station. William was also a gifted musician. He sang in a cappella groups and played the bagpipes. During his time at Annapolis, he led the Pipes and Drums, which toured the U.S. and played in parades, including the St. Patrick's Day Parade in Boston. We remember William as someone who lived his dreams and died serving his nation. On behalf of the El Paso community, I am proud to honor William's extraordinary life and his service. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to salute the Doolittle Raiders. 71 years ago this Thursday, 16 Army bombers took off from the flight deck of an aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet. The Hornet was spotted hundreds of miles by the Japanese before their intended launch point. Led by Colonel Doolittle, all 16 bombers were launched, knowing that they would not have the fuel for safe shelter. They would crash land in enemy territory. A short 4 months after Pearl Harbor, these heroes bombed Tokyo and sent a message to the world that America would win World War II. 80 pilots took off that day. 4 of them are still alive. They're having their last reunion this week. I ask my colleagues to support H.R. 1209, which will give a Congressional Gold Medal to the Doolittle Raiders and give them one final honor before their final flight home. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Nevada rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday was a tragic day, and our thoughts and prayers are those who lost their lives or were injured during the Boston Marathon, as well as the families and friends of those affected. The character of our country was reflected in the Boston police and firefighters, the first responders, the nurses and the medical providers, the people donating blood, the residents offering shelter and care, the thousands praying for healing, and everyone opening their doors in Boston to care for those in need. Today, we are all Bostonians. There are no words to console those who have lost loved ones, but Congress will assist those in Boston and Massachusetts in any way possible. As we await answers, we will continue to make emergency preparedness, responsiveness, and caring for those in need a priority. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Indiana rise?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise on behalf of Indiana's 6th Congressional District to express our condolences to the victims of yesterday's bombing in Boston. The thoughts and prayers of every American are with those who were killed and maimed by this unspeakable horror. We don't yet know who turned what should have been a day of triumph into a day of tragedy. But those whose lives have been forever changed by this terror should know that their government will not rest until the responsible are brought to justice. May God bless the victims, comfort their families, and continue to watch over the United States of America. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio rise? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to join my fellow Ohioans to thank President Obama and Secretary Salazar for the designation of the Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers National Monument in the great state of Ohio in Wilberforce, Ohio. This monument recognizes the legacy of Charles Young and the proud tradition of African Americans in our military over the last nearly 150 years. I join my good friend Marsha Bayless, mayor of Xenia, Ohio, who is in D.C. today, because we believe that it is a great honor for our community that the home of this outstanding American, the first African American to reach the rank of colonel, be recognized and honored. I urge the House to wholeheartedly support the President's efforts to preserve the American heritage through the Antiquities Act. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Montana rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to express my concern and opposition to legislation introduced today in the House of Representatives by Representatives King and Thompson. This bill, which mirrors a recent Senate proposal to expand background checks, holds threats to our Second Amendment rights while doing little to actually address the underlying problems behind violent crimes. As thousands of Montanans have shared with me, expanding Washington bureaucracy and restricting the rights of law-abiding citizens is the wrong approach. This is the #1 issue I hear about from the people of my great state. As a fifth-generation Montanan and a lifelong sportsman, I am deeply committed to protecting the rights that thousands of Montanans lawfully exercise every day. And we recognize the Second Amendment is not about hunting, it is about freedom. That's why I joined my colleague, Representative Steve Stockman, in calling on the House to block any proposals that undermine the Second Amendment, and I will continue to fight against any proposals, whether in the House or the Senate, that threatens Montanans' Second Amendment rights. Thank you, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from New Hampshire rise?
I rise to address the House for 1 minute, to request,
Unanimous consent to address the House? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much. In the wake of yesterday's tragedy in Boston, I come to the floor with a very heavy heart. In the days and weeks to come, we'll remember those we lost and those who were injured. We'll remember where we were when we first heard the news, and we'll remember how a cowardly act of violence shattered a beautiful Boston day. But we'll also remember the extraordinary heroism that we saw in Boston yesterday. In the immediate aftermath of the explosion, when every human instinct tells you to seek safety and to run away, our fearless first responders ran toward danger, selflessly putting themselves in harm's way to save others. In the worst of that moment, we saw the best of America. In times of crisis, we stick together. We take care of one another. We put the needs of others before our own. And no one exemplifies this more than those brave Americans who rushed to aid the victims of this horrific crime. As law enforcement works to identify those responsible for these cowardly acts, I join all Granite Staters in sending my thoughts and prayers to the victims, their families, and the entire city of Boston. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today on behalf of the people of Oregon's 2nd District to offer my deepest sympathies to the families of the victims of the senseless act of terrorism in Boston. Scripture tells us, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." Our prayers go to those who lost loved ones and to the injured as they recover so that they may be comforted. Our thanks go to the first responders and Good Samaritans who selflessly assisted the victims yesterday. That's what Americans do. They help their fellow men and women in time of need. That's a common bond, and it unites us. Boston's the birthplace of the American Revolution, the cradle of liberty for our nation. That spirit of freedom and brotherhood lives on in us as Americans and brings us closer together in our grief. As Americans, we will care for the victims and for their families. We will ensure that justice is done for those behind these cowardly attacks, and we will emerge as a nation stronger than ever before.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Hawaii rise? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as we begin the much-anticipated discussion on immigration reform, we have tended to overlook a critical aspect of it, and that is called family reunification. What's the problem? Family reunification has arbitrary caps and major backlogs. The caps are about 114,000 per country, and most countries have an average of 10 years of backlog. They're working on 2,003 applications. But there's one country that has had a greater rate, and that is the Philippines. This is the saddest example. The Filipino World War II veterans, they were promised full rights when fighting with us against the Japanese in World War II. After the war, there was a Rescission Act of 1946, which took away that promise. In 1990, we finally made good on the promise, but we are processing 1989 applicants to reunify these families. Many can't travel anymore. Many can't wait. Families are critical to the success of this country. Small businesses are built with families. The values of unity, caring for elders. We must keep our promise. I yield back, Mr. Speaker.
Gentlelady's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House of Representatives.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, on a day meant to celebrate patriots' freedom and personal strength, we witnessed terror and tragedy. My prayers remain with the victims and everyone in Boston. I'm grateful for the first responders, the medical professionals, and fellow citizens who responded so heroically. We don't know yet who's responsible for this terrorist attack. The United States government must and will use all tools at its disposal to track down the perpetrators and hold them accountable. This vicious act of terror cannot stand, and we must remain committed to the task of combating the scourge of terrorism no matter where it raises its ugly head. The Boston Marathon is a symbol of so much of what is great about America. It honors personal fortitude and perseverance. Let it continue to be a symbol of fortitude and perseverance for Boston and for our entire nation. And I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas rise? Without objection, the gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman. I have been on this floor yesterday and today, earlier this morning, to offer my sympathy to those who lost their lives and suffer in Boston and say that we're united with them. But this Congress now is proceeding on some important business, and I offer to my colleagues that we cannot wait to pass legislation on gun safety and gun violence prevention. Homicide is the second leading cause of death for young people ages 15 to 24. Homicide is the leading cause of death for many minorities in this country. 82.8% of those who are young people are killed with a firearm. Every 30 minutes, a child or teenager in America is injured by a gun. Every 3 hours and 15 minutes, a child or a teenager loses their life to a firearm. And in 2010, 82 children under 5 years of age lost their lives due to guns. We must respond. I've introduced H.R. 65, which indicates prevention or a system to prevent children to have access to guns. Children who have accidentally shot themselves, shot their parents, because the guns have been accessible, because we as adults have not been responsible. As we work across the houses, it is important to pass gun violence prevention legislation, and do it now. It does not violate the Second Amendment. I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise? Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, it's 3 strikes and you're out for the Senate's immigration proposal. First, it legalizes almost everyone in the country illegally before the border is secured. This, of course, will encourage even more illegal immigration. Second, it puts the interest of foreign workers ahead of the interest of American workers. The immigration plan allows millions of illegal immigrants to compete with American workers, driving down their wages. And third, it treats illegal immigrants better than those who have played by the rules and waited their turn in line to come into the United States. Illegal immigrants get legal status immediately. The law-abiding, well, they just have to continue waiting. I don't think the American people are going to give the Senate another turn at bat.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Florida rise?
Speaker, I ask unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The indebtedness of the United States is reaching $17 trillion. Just a few weeks ago, Europe, the entire world, Americans shuddered when they saw in Cyprus what took place. Imagine going to the bank and having the door closed. Imagine putting your ATM card in and not being able to get funds. Imagine being restricted to taking $300 a day. What happened in Cyprus can happen in the United States. Remember also accounts for people who worked hard, had invested and put their accounts and money away. They came in, and if you had $100,000, the government skimmed off the top. Look at President Obama's proposal in his budget. Look at his restrictions and also taxing and taking from those who have retired. The same thing can happen in America that's happened in other countries. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman's time has expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania rise?
Mr. Speaker, request unanimous consent to address the House for 1 minute and revise and extend.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to urge my colleagues to support H.R. 1520, the POW-MIA Accounting and Recovery Support Act of 2013. The Joint POW-MIA Accounting Command, or JPAC, is a task force within the Department of Defense with a mission to account for prisoners of war or those missing in action from all past conflicts. It's part of a commitment we have made to these American heroes along with their families and loved ones seeking closure. As most are aware, the Pentagon recently announced plans to furlough as many as 800,000 federal civilian workers in order to achieve spending reductions under the Budget Control Act. These workers will be required to take 14 unpaid days off between now and October. As a result, JPAC employees will have to take at least 1 furlough day a week with no exceptions. Well, this will significantly impact JPAC's accounting and recovery teams, which are actually deployed on operations that last between 35 and 45 days. The POW-MIA Accounting and Recovery Support Act will allow JPAC civilian employees to continue these critical missions without unnecessary disruption or delay. I encourage my colleagues to join me and Representative Stephen Lynch in co-sponsoring H.R. 1520, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time is expired. For what purpose does the gentleman from Kansas rise?
Address the House for 1 minute, seek unanimous consent, and revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, over 100 Kansans traveled across the country to take part in the world's most recognized marathon yesterday in Boston. We've all seen the images of the destruction caused by the cowardly acts of violence. But, Mr. Speaker, what was not cowardly was the instinct and immediate reaction of so many first responders, countless spectators who are watching their loved ones partake in the Patriots' Day tradition. Cowardly doesn't describe runners who pass the finish line after running 26 miles and immediately, without hesitation, turned around, running back to help. Those heroes include Dr. Chris Roop from Salina, Kansas. Chris finished the race and was only 10 yards away from the first explosion. Dr. Roop turned and ran to help the injured the way Kansans do, the way so many Americans did. Mr. Speaker, there is still much to determine in regards to the details from yesterday, and we will get those answers, I am sure of it. What is known for certain is the bravery and courage of the American people in Kansans like Dr. Roop, in emergencies and times of tragedy like yesterday in Boston. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, the Chair will postpone further proceedings today on motions to suspend the rules on which a recorded vote or the yeas and nays are ordered, or on which the vote incurs objection under Clause 6 of Rule 20. Record votes on postponed questions will be taken later. For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I move that the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1163.
The clerk will report the title of the bill.
H.R. 1163, a bill to amend Chapter 35 of Title 44 United States Code to revise requirements relating to federal information security and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa, and the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, will each control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume and ask unanimous consent that members may have 5 legislative days within which to revise and extend their remarks and include extraneous materials on the bill under consideration.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Cybersecurity threats represent one of the most serious national security and economic challenges we face in our nation. Whether it's criminal hackers, organized crime, terrorist networks, or nation-states, our nation is under siege from dangerous cybersecurity threats that grow daily in frequency and sophistication. It is critical that the federal government address cybersecurity threats in a manner that keeps pace with our nation's growing dependence on technology. But current federal law does not adequately address the nature of today's cybersecurity threats. Since its enactment in 2002 of the Federal Information Security Management Act, or FISMA, it has become a check-the-box compliance activity that all too often has little to do with minimizing cyber threats. And yet, the Government Accountability Office recently found that security incidents among 24 key agencies increased by 650%, or more than 6-fold in the last 5 years. To address the rising challenge posed by cyber threats, Ranking Member Cummings and myself introduced in the last Congress a bill to reauthorize FISMA. That bill was adopted by the House unanimously. Recently, Mr. Cummings and I reintroduced legislation as H.R. 1163, the Federal Information Security Amendments Act of 2013. The bill was voted out of our committee by a unanimous vote on March 20th. The bill aims to harness the last decade of technology and innovation in securing federal information systems. To enhance the current framework of securing federal information technology systems, our bill calls for automated and continuous monitoring of government information systems. And I'm going to repeat, automated and continuous monitoring of government information systems. And it ensures that the continuous monitoring finally incorporates regular threat assessments, not just check the box. The bill also reaffirms the role of the Office of Management and Budget with respect to FISMA. Recognizing that the budgetary leverage of the Executive Office of the President is necessary to ensure agencies are focused on effective security IT systems. And, Mr. Speaker, that's particularly significant because IT is the backbone of every single large and small agency of the government, and only with the power of the President through the Office of Management and Budget can you, in fact, ensure that the President has transparency and his authority is respected throughout all these agencies. We can no longer afford the check the box that came out of the first piece of legislation. It wasn't its intent, and the 6-fold increase in the last 5 years says it has failed us. Well, our bill does not include new requirements, restrictions, or mandates on private, non-federal computer systems. 1163 does highlight the need for stronger public-private partnership. Again, As we interface over the public internet, it is critical that the weakest link be prevented. To that extent, this bill has received strong support from cybersecurity experts and industries including Tech America, the Information Technology Industry Council, and the Business Software Alliance. I'd like to personally thank the ranking member, Mr. Cummings, for partnering both personally and through his staff to create a bill that is necessary, timely, and accurate to meet the growing threat of cybersecurity. And I encourage all members to support this timely legislation, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
I want to begin by thanking our chairman, Chairman Issa, for sponsoring this legislation and for making this a truly bipartisan effort. I'm pleased to join the chairman in sponsoring this bill again this Congress. Also, I thank the other co-sponsors of the bill, including the chairman and the ranking member of the subcommittee on government operations, Representatives John Mica and Jerry Connolly, and the chairman and the ranking member of the subcommittee on national security, Representatives Jason Chaffetz and John Tierney. Last month, the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, placed cyber attacks at the top of his list of national security threats. This bill is an important step in Congress's response to the cyber threat. This legislation would ensure that federal agencies use a risk-based approach to defend against cyber attacks and protect government information from being compromised by our adversaries. It is important that the federal government set the example by ensuring that its own information is protected. The Department of Energy was hacked in January, and personal data for hundreds of employees was compromised. We are better than that, Mr. Speaker, and we can do better. Personal data for more than 100,000 accounts in the thrift savings plans was compromised last year when a contractor's computer was hacked. This bill would shift the federal government to a system of continuous monitoring of information systems. And just this morning, the chairman said in a hearing that we have to do more with less, and we have to figure out ways to use technology so that we can efficiently and effectively do the things that we need to do. And this bill goes right in that direction, which is so important. It would also streamline reporting requirements and ensure that agencies take a smart, risk-based approach to securing networks. This bill would continue to authorize the Office of Management and Budget to set federal policy for information security. This is important because we need to hold all the agencies accountable for developing appropriate standards and living up to those very standards. OMB is the appropriate entity to be responsible for ensuring that that happens. However, nothing in this bill would prevent the Department of Homeland Security from continuing the great work it is doing to protect our nation against potential cyber attacks. The Department has expanded its cyber security workforce and is working with agencies to establish continuous monitoring. This bill supports that work by making clear that agencies must take action to protect their networks rather than just doing routine check-the-box reports, as the Chairman Issa just talked about. And so today we have a bipartisan effort. It is a truly bipartisan effort to address a problem that affects every single American and businesses, every entity of our nation. And that's why it's so good that we had all of our subcommittee rankings and chairmen working together, Mr. Issa making sure that this legislation got out. And I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this legislation is so very, very important. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from California is recognized.
I yield myself 1 minute. And I want to associate myself with the ranking member's statements. Mr. Cummings does make the great point that Homeland Security is, in fact, doing a great deal. And if there's an active activity through NSA and other agencies, we applaud that. A great deal of what this bill, reauthorization, is intended to do, and working with subcommittee ranking member Mr. Connolly, is to recognize that there needs to be a public-private partnership. We need our private entities to be as strong as they can be so they don't become conduits for espionage and for attacks, but also that, in fact, it's the smallest entity of government, the one that you don't think much of, the one that may not be high priority, that in fact also has to be protected. Commerce at our public parks, commerce occurring throughout the federal government, and in fact just the records that are so often collected and maintained in places like the Veterans Administration and so on. Although they may not represent an immediate national, I yield myself an additional 30 seconds.
Recognize.
Although they may not represent an immediate threat to national security, as a veteran, I must tell you that the fact that those records sit there tells all of us, millions of veterans, that we want to have a robust maintenance of cybersecurity, something that under the current statute we believe the box is being checked, but not all that needs to be done is being done. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from reserves. Gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
It gives me great pleasure, Mr. Speaker, to yield 3 minutes to a gentleman who has worked very hard on this issue night and day, and it's been at the forefront of his efforts, Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the distinguished ranking member, my friend from Maryland, and I also thank the distinguished chairman of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee. I proudly join them in co-sponsoring this legislation and rising in strong support of H.R. 1163, the Federal Information Security Amendments Act of 2013. The chairman and ranking member of the full committee have worked in a bipartisan fashion to advance this bill to the floor today, and they deserve great credit. H.R. 1163 is desperately needed to address a looming and critical threat to our nation's economic and national security. As the U.S. Government Accountability Office testified before our committee in its 2013 high-risk report, the number of cyber incidents has grown exponentially among federal agencies and, for that matter, in the private sector. Specifically, in the year 2006, they reported 5,503 cyber incidents to the U.S. Computer Emergency Readiness Team. 6 years later, that same number was 48,562, 782% increase in just 6 years. According to the Government Accounting Office, cyber attacks involving federal systems and critical infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, could be devastating to the country. Yet, its audits have consistently revealed information security deficiencies in public and private financial and non-financial systems. More troubling, despite producing hundreds of recommendations over the past 2 fiscal years that would address security control deficiencies, the majority of GAO's recommendations have in fact not been fully implemented. Unfortunately, vital federal asset submissions will remain at high risk for fraud, misuse, and disruption unless agencies fully implement the literally hundreds of recommendations made by the GAO and various offices of the Inspector Generals aimed at strengthening the security of critical information systems. The sophisticated and rapidly evolving cybersecurity threat has outpaced the security framework established by the former Federal Information Security Management Act of 2002. FISMA's static, compliance-based framework, as noted by both the ranking member and the distinguished chairman of the committee, must be enhanced. It can't be used as a substitute for developing strategies to counter this threat. I believe this bipartisan legislation will accomplish that goal by enhancing FISMA to promote a more dynamic, risk-based approach that leverages current technology to implement continuous monitoring of Networks and Systems. Specifically, the FISMA Amendments Act will direct agencies to test and evaluate information security controls and techniques, conduct threat assessments by monitoring information systems and identifying potential system vulnerabilities, conduct vulnerability assessments and penetration tests. If I may have 30 more seconds.
You owe the gentleman a minute and a half.
I thank the distinguished ranking member.
Recognized.
Commensurate with the risk posed to agency information systems, and to collaborate with OMB and appropriate public and private sector security operations centers on security incidents that extend beyond the control of the agency, to require that security incidents be reported through an automated and continuous monitoring capability to the Federal Information Security Incident Center, appropriate security operations centers and respective agencies of the offices of Inspector General. Mr. Speaker, I join the distinguished chairman and ranking member of the Oversight and Government Reform Committee, urging all members to support this critical bipartisan cybersecurity legislation that is urgently needed to provide federal agencies with the necessary tools to effectively secure our federal information systems, and I thank them both for their leadership on this critical matter. With that, I yield back to the ranking member.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California is recognized.
I would reserve at this time.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Maryland is recognized.
I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentleman's recognized.
As we have no other speakers, Mr. Speaker, I just want to make it clear. I think yesterday's incident in Boston reminds us, or should remind us, of how fragile our society is, and that there are so many people who want to do us harm. And a lot of times we concentrate on those kinds of attacks and don't spend the kind of time we really need to on these cyber attacks, which can be just as harmful, just as damaging, and these cyber attacks can literally bring our country and our economy to a halt. And that's why we are urging all members to vote in favor of this. And it is my hope, Mr. Speaker, that as we are addressing this issue today, that it'll send a word out to the nation that once again our committee and this Congress is putting a microscope on this issue and doing everything in our power to make sure that our efforts are effective and efficient, because the threats are there and they are real. And it is up to us. It is our watch. It's our watch, just like a watchman watching over a fort or watching over a city. We are the watchmen right now, and it's our watch, and we have to make sure we do everything in our power to make sure that we protect against this very, very clear threat. And with that, I yield back and urge all members to vote in favor of this legislation.
Gentleman from Maryland yields back his time. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself the remaining time.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Speaker, H.R. 1163 has many authors, Mr. Cummings and myself, Mr. Connolly, Mr. Chaffetz, Mr. Tierney. But it also has every committee chairman and every ranking member here in the House. And I'd like to take a moment to thank all the committee chairmen, Homeland Security and Foreign Affairs, House Administration, because staffs from all of those committees, particularly and with the acquiescence of their chairman and ranking members, have contributed to our fact-finding to try to produce a good bill here today. And I think often our committee is viewed as, what is your authority, and so on. This is an odd situation in which, in order for us to bring the bill here today, we really needed all the agencies and all the personnel here to be brought to bear so that we could try to fashion a piece of legislation that would allow the federal government to work better, that would allow the executive branch to execute better on behalf of the American people. Lastly, I'd like to thank the outside groups, many of which I mentioned in my opening statement, but even more who responded when this bill was posted for comment. They responded with constructive suggestions. I know there's a lot of trepidation any time the government is in fact looking at data passing through the system. But this and other legislation is a balancing act. We cannot have the economy that we enjoy today if these systems are shut down by attacks. At the same time, I know I join with the ranking member and all the authors of this legislation that we're committed to make sure we maintain the personal freedom and the privacy that goes with what we're entrusted to here in the government. So in closing, Mr. Speaker, this is an update. It is not the last time we will have to update cybersecurity. It is not the last time we will be here concerned about America's economy so dependent on the Internet. But it is a good bill. It is ready. I urge its approval and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California yields back. The question is, will the House suspend the rules and pass H.R. 1163? Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, two-thirds being in the affirmative. Gentleman from California.
Mr. Speaker, on this I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. All those in favor of taking the vote by yeas and nays will rise and remain standing until counted. A sufficient number having arisen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Pursuant to Clause 8 of Rule 20, further proceedings on this question will be postponed. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas rise?
Mr. Speaker, I move to suspend the rules and pass the bill H.R. 756, Cybersecurity Enhancement Act of 2013.
The clerk will report the title of the bill. Is the gentleman calling up the bill as amended?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
The clerk will report the title.
Union Calendar Number 19, H.R. 756, a bill to advance cybersecurity research, development, and technical standards and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith, and the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Johnson, each will control 20 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith.
Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members may have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks and to include extraneous material on H.R. 756, the bill now under consideration.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I thank Representatives McCall and Representative Lipinski for introducing this common-sense bipartisan legislation. Now, I'm pleased to be an original co-sponsor of H.R. 756, the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act of 2013. As our reliance on information technology expands, so do our vulnerabilities. Cyber attacks against U.S. government and private sector networks are on the rise. Protecting America's cyber systems is critical to our economic and national security. Keeping our cyber infrastructure secure is a responsibility shared by different federal agencies, including the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Standards and Technology. The Cybersecurity Enhancement Act coordinates research and development activities to better address evolving cyber threats. The legislation promotes much-needed research and development to help create new technologies and standards that better protect America's information technology systems. To improve America's cybersecurity abilities, this bill strengthens activities in 4 areas. 1, strategic planning for cybersecurity research and development needs across the federal government. 2, basic research at National Science Foundation, which we know is important to increasing security over the long term. 3, National Science Foundation scholarships to improve the quality of the cybersecurity workforce. And 4, improved research, development, and public outreach organized by NIST related to cybersecurity. These are modest but important changes that will help us better protect our cyber networks. Cyber attacks threaten our national and economic security. To solve this problem, America needs a solution that involves the cooperation of many public and private sector entities. We must develop a rigorous scientific foundation for cybersecurity. This legislation helps foster such an effort, which will make our computer systems more secure. The bill was recently approved by the Science, Space, and Technology Committee with strong bipartisan support. I again thank my Science Committee colleagues, Representatives McCall and Lipinski, for their initiative on this issue and look forward to this bill becoming law. Mr. Speaker, the following groups have written letters of support for H.R. 756, the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act: Tech America, U.S. Chamber of Commerce, U.S. Telecom, Information Technology Industry Council, National Association of Manufacturers, Financial Services Roundtable, Computing Research Association, Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers, Society for Industrial and Applied Mathematics, and the U.S. Public Policy Council of the Association for Computing Machinery. Mr. Speaker, I'll reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
Gentlewoman is recognized.
I rise in support of H.R. 756, the Cybersecurity Enhancement Act of 2013. This is a good bipartisan bill. It is nearly identical to the legislation that passed the House floor by overwhelming majority last Congress. And I'd like to thank my colleagues, Mr. Lipinski and Mr. McCall, for their leadership and dedication to improving our nation's cybersecurity. Almost every one of us uses a computer, a cell phone, and the Internet every single day. These technologies have greatly increased our productivity and connectivity, and they have become a key component of our economy. Unfortunately, if you pick up the newspapers, you're likely to see another story about a hacker bringing down a website, stealing credit card numbers, or gaining access to a company's intellectual property. We need to do what we can do to help ensure that these sorts of cyber intrusions are minimized. And I am pleased that H.R. 756 addresses a number of critical issues. It strengthens the public-private partnerships, guarantees a proactive and comprehensive research and development portfolio, ensures the development of robust cybersecurity standards, and trains the next generation of cybersecurity professionals. Both of the agencies covered in H.R. 756, the National Science Foundation and the National Institute of Standards and Technology, play important and unique roles in the federal government's effort to secure cyberspace. I strongly believe that these agencies and the activities they support are vital to our nation's future prosperity. We not only need to protect the security of our current information systems, but we need to build the next generation of systems, systems that are more secure from the first time they are turned on. President Obama previously stated that cyber threats are one of the most serious economic and national security challenges we face as a nation. And that cutting-edge research and development and commitment to science, math, and education are central to securing America's information and communication networks. I cannot agree more. Cybersecurity is a critical issue, and it becomes more important day by day. Addressing this issue will not be easy, but is absolutely necessary. H.R. 756 will help build up our cybersecurity capabilities through research and education. This is a good bipartisan bill that should be included in any comprehensive effort to keep our nation, our businesses, and our citizens safe from malicious cybersecurity attacks. Before I conclude, I'd like to thank my staff and the majority staff for their hard work on this bill. In particular, I'd like to thank Marcy Gallo for her efforts on this bill in this Congress and the past Congresses as well. I look forward to working with my colleagues to make sure this bill makes it to the President's desk. I urge my colleagues to support H.R. 756, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Woman reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Texas, a member of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, and the sponsor of this legislation, Mr. McCall.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. McCall, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank my fellow Texan and friend, Chairman Smith, for his support, Ranking Member Johnson, and Dan Lipinski, my cohort on this bill. We've passed this in 2 Congresses prior. This will be our 3rd attempt, and let's hope the 3rd time will be a charm. For most of us around the country, it's hard to think of anything else other than the terrorist attack in Boston yesterday. It's a solemn reminder of the threats that we face. While the attention of the American people is focused on the physical attack that occurred during the Boston Marathon, I think it's important that we as leaders in this chamber be frank with the American people about the virtual threat of a cyber attack against our national and economic security interests. We must be vigilant against both. The United States faces several daunting challenges at this moment in history, including emerging threats that we must as a nation be prepared to face head-on. Congress is often blamed for not rising to the occasion by being too reactive to events or failing to act at all. I am determined, as my colleagues are, that this Congress tackles head-on the problem of our vulnerable cyber defenses and bolster our security in cyberspace. Last month, our country's top intelligence officials told Congress that the U.S. is vulnerable to cyber espionage, cybercrime, and outright destruction of computer networks, both from sophisticated government-sponsored assaults from countries like China and Iran, as well as criminal hacker groups and cyber terrorists. We know that foreign nations are conducting reconnaissance on our critical infrastructures and utilities, including our gas lines and water systems and energy grids. And if the ability to send a silent attack through our digital networks falls into our enemy's hands, this country could be the victim of a devastating attack. Last December, Iran attacked the state-owned Saudi Aramco with the goal of stopping Saudi Arabia's oil production. Additionally, this year, Iran conducted multiple denial-of-service attacks on major U.S. banks, and just last year, an al-Qaeda operative issued a call for electronic jihad against the United States, comparing our technological vulnerabilities to that of our security before 9/11. Yet while these threats are imminent, no major cybersecurity legislation that would help protect us has been enacted since 2002. Quite simply, we are not prepared to meet the threats of the 21st century. This act improves coordination in government, providing for a strategic plan to assess the cybersecurity risk and guide the overall direction of the federal cyber R&D. It updates the National Institutes of Standards and Technology responsibilities to develop security standards for federal computer systems to ensure computer hygiene and processes for agencies to follow. Our bill also establishes a federal university private sector task force to coordinate research and development, improves the training of cyber professionals, and continues much-needed cybersecurity research and development programs at the National Science Foundation and in NIST. This bill has been endorsed, as the chairman stated, by leading industry groups, including the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Tech America. Most importantly, this bill is fiscally responsible. It is not being paid with any new money, since it is intended to work within the boundaries of funds authorized and already appropriated to NSF and NIST. I'm confident that this legislation will advance the work these agencies are doing to bolster our domestic cybersecurity, as much as I'm confident that this Congress will finally address in a meaningful way the urgent need to pass this bipartisan cybersecurity legislation at this time. So I urge my colleagues to support this legislation, and with that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman